Today we are in week 7 of this series on the book of Revelation. And 7, of course, is the number of perfection. And so therefore, I expect that this morning's message will be flawless. And you'll remember it forever. And you will not go home and critique it over lunch or anything like that. It's just a perfect message. So we ended last week at the scene of worship at the throne in chapter 11 of Revelation. And I thought that we would start there because it kind of sets a scene for the next chapter. Verse 15, the world has now become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. So in other words, God's kingdom in heaven has come to earth finally. And then we read how the whole thing resets in verse 17. It says, the nations were filled with wrath, but now the time of your wrath has come. It is the time to judge the dead and reward your servants, the prophets, as well as your holy people and all who fear your name, from the least to the greatest. It is time to destroy all who have caused destruction. And so we talked about over the last couple times now, we've talked about how the structure of Revelation and sort of the story of Revelation is repeated kind of 3 times. And as it's repeated, its scope is wider and wider. And so John sets up the next cycle here at the end of this chapter, this time sort of zooming out even further than what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks with politics and the empires and the nations and what does it look like for Christ to have victory over that, and further than the local context of just the immediate church. And now here we are, and says we are focusing on the things which destroy the earth, the thing which destroy the earth. And it is important that we don't read that verse incorrectly. Because popular end-time thinking often has us understanding that God's wrath is going to be unleashed and he will come and he will destroy the earth, right? And it's all going up in a big fireball, and you just don't want to be caught up in that. But that is not what the verse says. It says God is destroying that which destroys the earth, or this passage or this version here says that. But what is it then that wreaks havoc on the earth? What is it? What is that which destroys the earth? What is that which causes exploitation and injustice and racism and all of these awful, terrible things that destroy the earth, destroy our creation? What is that? Well, I think we know that the answer is evil, right? So that then begs the question, what is evil? What is evil? This is an important question because we all know evil when we see it. Like, that's not hard to figure out. The abuse of a child, the murder of the innocent, the exploitation of the vulnerable, Epstein Island, war. All of these things we can point at and be like, those things are definitively evil. Nobody denies that, but what is evil? And why is evil? And from a biblical perspective, the question that we'll look at this morning is, who is evil? Because as we're about to read, Revelation, John here, the author of Revelation, he personifies evil in the form of a dragon, or the Satan, and that means the accuser. This is what Pastor Brian Zahn says. He puts it like this. He says, the satanic is probably best understood as an enormously complex spiritual psychic phenomenon of accusation leading to organized violence. More than a metaphor, but less than a person, the Satan is the phenomenon of accusation and violence that rules the world, but is almost never perceived for what it is because the God of this world has blinded our minds. So he's getting at, we can't fully wrap our heads around what is evil, what is the nature of evil, because, as Zahn suggests, and he's referencing Paul here in 2 Corinthians 4 says this, the God of this age, Satan, has blinded us from perceiving that clearly. So at best, what we do as humans to understand this is we develop metaphors, and we tell stories, and use symbols to make sense of this very real thing called evil that all of us have experienced in some shape or form directly. I listened to a podcast this week with New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, who many of us are familiar with in this room, and he just wrote a book on Ephesians. And so he's talking about Ephesians in this podcast, and at one point he's talking about evil, and he uses this helpful metaphor. He calls evil this parasitic presence, and that it's this thing that seeks to attach to every good thing in this good creation, and its work is to drain the goodness out of it. I felt like that's a really strong metaphor, a really strong picture, image of what evil is and what it does. And so he says that as you and I seek to be the community of our Creator God here on earth, we can be sure that the dark powers of what Wright calls anti-creation, the things that go against creation, work tirelessly to unmake the goodness of creation, to strike back. So this idea of parasitic dark powers of anti-creation sounds really cool, but I feel like that's as good a definition of evil as I've ever heard, right? Because evil works like an infection. It works like a parasite. It finds its way into our human systems and our human hearts and our human cultures, and it begins to suck the goodness out of all that God has made. And your experience and my experience has shown time and again that whatever evil happens to be, it can be expressed in 1,000 different ways, right? From the exploitation of creation, to the dehumanizing of our neighbors, to addiction, to deceit, to scapegoating, manipulating, to the hardening of our hearts. All of its various forms, all of its expressions, however, culminate in some expression of anti-creation, of undoing the good creation that God has given us. And this is what actually makes God angry. We often think God's angry at us, but God is looking at the effects of evil in this world and how it undoes us. And that upsets him. And so the destructive powers that keep vandalizing his world and crushing his beloved, which is you and I, is what frustrates him and angers him. And it should anger us. And this text we're about to read is John's way of communicating to us how God would have us understand this reality called evil, and ultimately, as we'll see, how powerless evil truly is. It seems like it's really big and scary and important. And don't get me wrong, it's not something to take lightly. But in light of the goodness and the beauty and the power of our Jesus, evil really doesn't have much of a leg to stand on. So I'm not going to read the entire chapter 12, but I want to read just a few verses, and then I'll kind of speak to it here and there, and we'll kind of weave in and out. You can read the chapter on your own at some point this week, I think would be helpful. But I'm going to start verse 3. It says this: "Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event." So John is back in heaven. Again, like the cycle resets. Every cycle he begins in heaven and sees the story of things unfolding. But keep in mind, he is seeing this stuff happen from the vantage point of heaven, which you and I don't have. So it's going to make even less sense than it normally would. "Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky, and he threw them to the earth. He stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. She gave birth to a son who was to rule all nations with an iron rod, and her child was snatched away from the dragon, and he was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where God has prepared a place to care for her for 1,260 days, or 3.5 years." So now, at this point, we have been familiar enough with Revelation to understand that everything in Revelation, save the letters to the churches, are symbolic. Thank you, Bill, for clarifying that last week. But everything in this book is symbolic. And so before this, in verses 1 and 2. Again, I'm not going to read it this morning, but we read that John, again, he's in heaven. He sees this woman, and she is clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, because that happens. She's crowned with 12 stars. She's pregnant, and she's crying out in labor. The imagery of John is just insane. It's just absolutely wild, isn't it? Anyway, so he sees this great dragon, terrifying, powerful, and this dragon is poised to devour this child as soon as it's born. The child is born, and it says that he's destined to rule the nations. And in a blink, the child is snatched up to God's throne. And the woman escapes into the wilderness, and she is cared for there. So from here, and we didn't read this, but from here the story escalates. There is a war in heaven, a battle between Michael and his angels against this dragon and his angels. Michael wins. The dragon is thrown down. He's enraged, and he turns his fury toward the woman who tries to sweep her away. He fails again. And then as the chapter ends, he turns toward the woman's offspring. And this is what we read in verse 17. The dragon declares war on the rest of her children, those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. There you go. So that is a wild story. How do we even make sense of this? Where do we even begin with this story? Well, let's take it slowly. Right off the top, we know that this is a symbol, right? John says there is a sign in the very first verse that is meant to form our imaginations in order to convey some deeper truth to us. Again, remember, Revelation's all symbolic, so we aren't to take this literally, but that doesn't mean it's not true, right? There's definitely truths here about the nature of evil, things that are too big for us to wrap our little puny human heads around. God uses these stories in order for us to grasp it, to be able to access it. And so, we know a few things. We know that the child being born, that she's pregnant with, is who? Who do you think? Yes, okay, good. Jesus, there's not a scholar that disputes that. He's to rule the nations, and so we know that that's Jesus. And does that then mean that the woman is Mary? Because Mary is the mother of Jesus. You would think so, right? And some people say, sure. And so it's kind of a yes and no thing. Like the woman, that's just, here's what N.T. Wright says. This is what he said. This has led some to suggest the woman in the story is Mary, the mother of Jesus, but that's too hasty by far. That's not how this kind of symbolism works. Right? And John tells us again in verse 1 that this is a sign, not a literal mother. So, others point to where the dragon makes war on the rest of her children in verse 17. Those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus, which sounds a lot like maybe the woman represents the church or the head of the church. And still others see her as a faithful, glorified Israel. It says in verse 1 about the 12 stars that she's crowned with, those being the 12 tribes of Israel. And Wright says it's not the faithless Israel who've been so often rebuked by the prophets, but the true, not the faithless Israel, but the true faithful Israel, like the idealized Israel. So which is it? Is it Mary? Does she represent the church? Does she represent the idyllic Israel? And there's good arguments for all of them, and I think the answer is yes. The woman is the whole story of God's faithful people, chosen, as Wright says, to carry forward his plans for the nations and indeed for the whole creation. So again, this is how symbolism works in Revelation. It's never just simple. Symbolism is never simple in this book, right? And so we have to expand our minds and be willing to be like, okay, it has to be more than just one thing. And it's important to understand how this woman operates or what she represents, because she's going to show up again and again in the book of Revelation. Later on, we will see that this beautiful woman is contrasted with another woman who is everything that this woman is not. So sort of like a caricature in the worst way. But we're not there yet. Okay, so that's the woman. We kind of have our head wrapped around that. We know who the child is. And then the dragon. This one's pretty easy. Who does the dragon represent? Okay, good. Good. I'm glad that we got that one. Satan, yes. This is, again, the personification of evil. The Satan. Okay, so let's back up. On one hand, this is essentially the Christmas story, told from the vantage point of heaven, right, if you think about it. Jesus is coming to earth, and it's sort of like within a single verse, his entire ministry and the whole incarnation is captured in just like one verse, and then he's swept back up to his throne. And again, the details are very sort of high level, but all we know is that somehow at the birth, life, death of Jesus, the dragon had sought to kill this Messiah, to destroy this Messiah, and he failed. And then he goes into this battle in heaven against Michael the archangel. And I love how Eugene Peterson says this, and it's a little bit long quote, but it's worth it. Let me just read this. The immediate consequence of the birth is not Christmas carols. We don't start singing Hark the Herald, but a great war spread across the heavens. The marvelous Michael, captain of the angels, joins battle with the dragon and his demon horde. Back and forth across the skies, the contest rages, and then, as suddenly as it began, it is over. The dragon and his host, no match for Michael and his angels, fall out of the sky in a heap. The word in Greek is bounced, unceremoniously tossed out. The terrorizing names, great dragon, ancient serpent, devil, Satan, deceiver of the whole earth, are a pile of dirty laundry on the ground. A pile of dirty laundry on the ground. So, after failing to destroy this child, a heavenly battle is waged in heaven, and again, the dragon loses. The deceiver is foiled in his attempt to undo the goodness of creation. So where does he go? He is thrown down to earth. In verse 9 we read this, the great dragon, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the whole world, was thrown down to the earth with all his angels. And this is very much in line with what the prophet Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 14. He says, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. And Jesus himself said this, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So pretty sure something's going on in the heavenly realm, that there's this battle of sorts, and Satan loses, and now he is on the earth. And this is the point, where we recognize as he is pursuing this woman, and again, the woman represents, among other things, the purposes of God for his good creation, right? And the text says in verse 15 that he goes after her and he tries to drown her with a flood of water that comes out of his mouth. But at this point, the creation helps itself. The creation opens up the ground and swallows all the water and spares the woman. These are wild, wild symbols. And so once again, the dragon fails. He can't defeat the child. He can't win the war in heaven. He can't destroy the woman. And it leaves us with this response. What a loser, right? So what is there left to do? Well, this is where he turns to the woman's offspring. And now, here is where the book stops, or the story stops being this weird Bible passage and requires us to sit up and to pay attention. Because it's offering us a glimpse into what is the reality of this present moment. Because it lays out for us, as clear as can be, the very battle that we happen to be in right now, proclaiming who our true enemy is. Again, let me read this in verse 17. And the dragon was angry at the woman and declared war against the rest of her children. This is you and this is me. Those who keep God's commandments, who maintain our testimony in Jesus. John is telling us here, the church, he's telling us to wake up. Right? This is the battle that we are in. We want to use that metaphor of battle and fighting. Our enemy is never those people. Right? It's never our neighbor. It's not the person who posts all that inflammatory garbage online that you just get frustrated with. Our enemy is not our boss or our ex-partner. It's not the political party that we roll our eyes at when we see them do all this stupid stuff online. It's also not the leaders of those political parties, whether on the left or the right. Right? It's not even the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world. That is not who our enemy is. That is not where evil is. I mean, there's evil in that. But there is something else altogether at work here, trying to destroy this good creation. And John wants us to see, and if we focus our hate and our disdain on these surface matters, on these conduits of evil, then we've lost the plot, right? We will be fighting the wrong battle altogether. And this is exactly what Paul says in Ephesians. You remember when he's talking about the armor of God. Why do we have to wear this armor of God? He says, because we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, against evil spirits in the heavenly places. This scene in Revelation 12 is John's apocalyptic way of proclaiming the very same reality. There is a deeper current beneath the surface of human conflict. Which means if we get tricked into treating people as the enemy, we are already off track. And I know this is my tendency, and I suspect this is your tendency as well. But let me say it again. If we treat people as the enemy, we have lost our way. Evil can affect us. It can empower us in a sense. It can inhabit us. But evil is not us. And it is not the person that is across from us. Before we wrap up this morning, I want to turn our attention back for a minute to this heavenly battle between Michael and the dragon. Because if our enemy is not one another, but this, again, personification of evil, how are we to fight that presence? How are we to fight that reality? And this is fascinating to me. The battle between Michael and the dragon offers some lessons for us as well. When you and I envision war, think about war, scenes of war in your mind, how do you envision it? What is used to win a war? Feel free to share with me. What is used to win wars, folks? Weapons. And what are those weapons like? Give me some examples of weapons that are used in battle. Missiles, bombs, what? Swords. Yeah, right. Weapons that kill. And that makes sense to us. They're like, yeah, if you're going to fight a war, the way you win a war is by having bigger weapons that kill than your opponent. Every single battle throughout all of human history has been fought that way. And so that makes, as we envision this heavenly battle, that's typically what we think about. We think of a battle in heaven being waged in the same way that a battle on earth would be waged, with weapons that kill. And in fact, if we go throughout history and we look at how this scene has been portrayed in art, it's exactly what we find. This is a picture, or a painting called The Fall of the Rebel Angels with St. Michael fighting the dragon. Very direct. It's from the 15th century. Let's see what's going on in this picture. There's all sorts of just death and bloodshed, and there's Michael overpowering the dragon. This by Neri de Bici, of course, everyone knows that. And this painting here is another story. This is about around the same time, the 15th century, by what is this guy? Antonio del Poleo. And you see again, he's got a sword, he's stabbing the dragon, and then, this one's a little bit more recent, this is from 1939. It's actually named the same thing. It's called, it's called St. Michael, St. Michael and the Dragon. It doesn't matter, but you can actually, maybe it's a little bit more abstract. So there's the sword, and it's full of blood, and he is killing the dragon. And again, this makes sense to us. When we think of a battle, we think of this kind of stuff going on, right? Except here's the thing. And this is what's so fascinating about the scriptures. You got to really read them to pay attention. So there's this loud voice, that shouts across heaven after Michael and his angels have experienced his victory. And now, first, we know that Satan has his own tactics of fighting, and they're really not very They're somewhat unscrupulous. He's not hesitant to kill and destroy. He uses violence all the time. And so it's strange then that the way Michael defeats him is not through bigger weapons, more violence, but this is what verse 11 says. They defeated him by the blood of the Lamb and by their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. The swords that went up against the Satan and his enemies look like the blood of the Lamb. The weapons look like their testimony. It looked like courage. Are we really surprised that those who fight for the slain Lamb, who gives his life, that those who are on his side, who would battle for him, would not be using swords to accomplish his ends? I don't mean to make light of this battle, but when I first read this, actually it was like yesterday morning, I was laying in bed and I was like, I had this picture that came to mind. When it talks about sharing our testimony as a way of defense, I asked AI to do this, and it's stupid. But I was raised in a Christian home. Like, that's how every testimony starts. I don't know if anyone else pictured that. I know that some of these ideas should probably just stay in my head. Anyway, the point, though, is that the way to overcome the enemy, or Satan, is never going to be through violence. It's not for Michael, it didn't work for him, and it won't work for us. There is no such thing as a violent way that leads to redemption. Stop believing that lie. And we just saw in the news this weekend that there's another attempt. If we just destroy the enemy, we'll have peace. And it won't work. It never does. What worked for Michael and his angels is the same battle tactics that work for us. Right? The blood of the Lamb, testimony, no fear of death. This is how evil is defeated. Do we believe that? Well, let's look at each of these very briefly. The blood of the Lamb. This means the dragon's greatest weapon, and his greatest weapon is accusation. His name, the Satan, actually means the accuser. It says this in verse 10, "For the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down to earth." As we said, Satan means the accuser. That's his native language. His native language is accusation and condemnation and just making you feel like crap. Have you ever felt within the weight of your own sin the heaviness that comes along, shame and condemnation, and this message that you are not worthy, that you suck, that you're not enough, that you are now beyond forgiveness? Have you experienced that in your own sin? I know I have. For those who are in Christ, though, the cross is where we are to begin with our victory over the Satan. I know it's easier said than done, but the cross gives us clarity of what divine love looks like. It allows us to respond in the face of these accusations from the enemy and say things like, my identity is not defined by my worst moment. I am forgiven. I am loved. I belong to the Lamb. He's already conquered Satan at the cross. And honestly, maybe from a very practical standpoint, it means being able to repeat a phrase like this over and over again until we actually believe it. Yeah? Because it's really easy to say, it sounds nice and fluffy, but it is the truth of all Scripture that the cross shows us conclusively and finally what it means for God to love us. His blood was shed for us. And accusation loses its power when grace has the final word. And the second weapon is their testimony. And I don't think it just means telling our story of faith, as important as those are. And of course it can mean that. But really, it's simply the refusal to stop telling the truth about Jesus with our lives. And that doesn't necessarily mean literally not speaking, though of course it can. But more prominently, through living out our convictions that are grounded in Jesus. So any time that we forgive instead of retaliate, we are testifying right? Anytime that we love someone that we have deemed unworthy of loving, we are testifying. Any time that we have refused to dehumanize someone who is made in God's image, no matter how awful and destructive and just brutal they are as a person, when we refuse to dehumanize them, we are testifying to Jesus. Or we choose the road of humility rather than pride. Whenever we do these things, we are saying effectively that Jesus is on the throne, that he has the victory. We are bearing witness to the way of the Lamb in our lives. And every act of faithful love pushes against the darkness. That's what it means to be testifying to Jesus. And finally, they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. In other words, they were not afraid of death. Fear held no power over them. And I'll look around, and it's not hard to see that today, currently, fear is the currency of our day, right? From the news, you listen to politicians, you listen even to marketing and how products are sold to us. They use fear as this great tool to manipulate us, all of us, right? And next week we're going to look at the next chapter 2, and we'll see how fear is the ultimate tool used by Satan to get us. It's very effective. And we'll look at how that's happening in our world today. Look around. You will always see the undercurrent of fear being used to manipulate and coerce us. But again, for those who are in Christ, we don't fear death because we've already seen that death has already been overcome. Amen? Death has lost its sting. This is our conviction. Because when fear loses its power, so does the dragon. So yes, friends, evil is real. It's cunning. Evil is, parasitic. We can call it that. It can wound and deceive, and it can suck out the good. And we don't make light of evil. We're not naive. But Revelation 12 refuses to let us be impressed by evil. Right? Because when evil finally shows its ugly face, what do we see? We see a dragon throwing temper tantrums because it keeps losing. That's why evil, for all of its posturing, is ultimately pathetic. Right? It cannot create, cannot heal. It can only harm. It can only corrupt. It can't make anything new. It can only try to unmake what God has already done. So, grassroots, let us not be fooled. Let us not be intimidated by the dragon's roar. Right? It's a good picture of what evil is. The dragon works pretty well. We can all visualize that. Really good. But I think Jesus is asking us and saying, hey, you don't have to be intimidated by this roar. It's ultimately toothless. It's fangless. We are instructed to stand with the Lamb, to keep telling the truth with our lives, to keep forgiving, to keep loving, to keep refusing to turn the other into our enemy, which is a temptation that is before us every single day. Right? That's how we overcome evil. Because when fear loses its power, so does the dragon. And when the Lamb is on the throne, the only effective weapon that will ever work against evil is self-giving love. Self-sacrifice. A love of our enemy. And that is the message we continually teach here at Grassroots, because we believe this is the conviction of what is at the heart of the gospel. Right? It is countercultural, counterintuitive, but this is how we overcome evil, is through loving selflessly.